Our scripture text this morning is Luke chapter 5. We're going to be reading the first 11 verses and then jumping to a scene that's shown in verses 27 to 32. I'll be reading from the NRSV. This is Luke chapter 5. Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Now verses 27 to 32. After this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance."
In Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. This is the way the Catholic theologian and author Robert Karras describes it. And we've been taking this as our roadmap for this summer, following Jesus through these various meals and tables that he sits at. We've been doing what Karras describes as in the title of his book, Eating Our Way Through Luke's Gospel. Started this a couple weeks ago, and if you have been paying attention, you may have a question. We are through 4 chapters of Luke's Gospel, and Jesus, to our knowledge, has not had a single morsel of food to eat yet. Jesus has not been doing the thing that Robert Karras says he's doing, being at a meal, going to a meal, coming from a meal. In some ways, we've been kind of setting the table. Maybe that's the way we'll think about this. We started with Mary's prophecy, this Magnificat that she sings in the early chapters of Luke before Jesus is born. And she anticipates what God is going to do, and she uses this analogy, this symbolism of food, that God is going to fill the hungry with good things, but send the rich away empty. There's this grand reversal that is coming through the ministry and message of Jesus. God is going to take this world that is upside down and set it right side up. But Jesus seems not content to just do this merely in the realm of human rulers. Mary also anticipates that God will tear the mighty down from their thrones and lift up the lowly. But Jesus seems to envision this in not just human terms and not just material terms, but in spiritual, even cosmic terms. So we saw last week this encounter between Jesus and the accuser, who we sometimes call the Satan. And their first confrontation centers on bread. Jesus has gone without food for 40 days. He's hungry. And the accuser comes to him and tempts him to turn stones into bread, but Jesus refuses. The early church leader Irenaeus of Lyon puts it this way. He says that the corruption of humankind that began in paradise when humanity ate doubly of that they were not supposed to eat, this corruption was undone by Christ's hunger in the world. And so Jesus is setting out, embarking on this grand reversal of what God is going to accomplish. And he's going to do an awful lot of that ministry at the table. And so this morning, finally, after all of this table setting, we are finally going to get to the table, to sit down with Jesus, to see what it is that he's up to. But before we can get to that, there's just a little bit more that needs to be done. Because the table has been set, but we aren't quite ready to eat because we're missing something. What are we missing? Food. Before Jesus sits at this table, he steps into the acquisition of food, what a restaurateur today might call sourcing ingredients. There has to be something to eat at this table. And so Jesus goes fishing. Or more accurately, Jesus goes amongst some fishermen. He goes out and he engages in this very common and significant practice of the day. Fishing was a very, very big deal. Last week we talked an awful lot about bread. And estimates suggest that probably about half of people's daily caloric intake in Jesus' day was bread. And then there was some legumes that they were eating, then there was some oil. What there wasn't an awful lot of was meat. And the little bit of meat that they did get often came from the sea. Now, we can debate whether fish is actually a meat or not. That's an open question, I think. But fish was significant. It was a major part of the economy and the diet of people. We can see this just in the names of places in and around where Jesus is ministering. There's a town called Bethsaida, which in Hebrew literally means house of fish. Or there's a town called Magdala that the Greek called Terakiae, which means place of processed fish. So they named their places after fish because fish was a big deal in their community. A plurality of the men that Jesus would end up calling as his disciples worked directly as fishermen before coming to follow Jesus. A lot of Jesus' miracles involve fish. The catching of fish, that we see this miracle recorded for us in the beginning of Luke 5, what we heard read for us. Or later on, the multiplying of fish, where people come together with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and from that meager amount, 5,000 people are fed. Jesus' teaching involves fish. He asks people, he says, which of you, if your child asks for a fish, will give them a snake? One biblical scholar says that when you look at the Gospels, you're struck by how much fishy stuff there is. There's so much conversation and talk about fish because it was an important part of their lives in that day and age. How many of you have been fishing at least once in your life? Go ahead and raise your hand. Most of us. Some of us have not. My hunch is that your experience of fishing was probably really, really different from Simon's experience of fishing. I think most of us, when we go fishing today, our primary objective is to relax. Right? We are going to take it easy. Now, we're doing that in maybe the stupidest way possible because we're going to do something that's not super successful. It's kind of like golf. Like you fail so much and somehow that failure becomes enjoyment. I don't quite understand how that works. I don't golf and I don't really fish that much, but I know that some people love it. But it's supposed to be relaxing. That's like the point. A day out on the lake or on the ocean. Sure, maybe you're going to bring some fish in. Maybe you hope to eat at least one of them. But it really is about relaxing. It's not so much about survival. But I think for Simon, fishing was about survival. There was not an awful lot of relaxation going on. I think it can be hard for us in our era, our experiences of fishing, to understand what Simon's life may have been like, working on the boats, being out on the lake. So I came across a story from actually just a couple months ago of someone who fishes pretty close in that part of the world to where Simon was, maybe 150 miles away or so. And I want you to listen and realize that as we're hearing this man's story, this is probably someone who looks and sounds an awful more lot like Simon than most of us would.
He's known as the Beast, and he hunts in the depths of the sea.
كلمة الوحش اللي سموني إياها.
People here call me the Beast because I managed to catch a fish that was more than 1.5 meters long. It's rare, but the truth is, I've caught many big fish.
Free diving is in Salim Abu Amir's blood. He learned from his father at a very young age. It's a skill that has been passed down through several generations and a way to support his family.
بطلنا نقدر نوصل للأماكن اللي إحنا كنا نوصلها قبل الحرب.
Restrictions have been imposed on us since the beginning of the war and continue to this day, but I have no source of livelihood. I can't just sit at home waiting for someone to support me.
Salim is not alone. Fishing was once a vital source of both income and food in Gaza, but the industry has been crippled.
الصيادين هم أكثر تعرض للمخاطر.
Fishermen are the most exposed to danger. Often the occupation forbids them from going to the sea, and freedivers cannot get their diving gear, which affects their ability to work.
بشكل حر مما يؤثر على الصيادين بالأيام القادمة.
والله أنا ناوي أورثها لأولادي لأنه
I'm determined to pass on my profession to my children. It's a pleasure and a hobby. Fishing relieves stress and provides an income.
So maybe you can see some of the similarities. Obviously, there are some differences. Simon was not a free diver. He was using nets, although it could be that there were people doing rudimentary forms of free diving back in his day. But they share this sense that this is not just a job, but this is a way of life. Simon's extended family is involved in this operation. Salim learned this trade from his father and intends to pass it on to his children. But you can also see the similarity that this is a difficult way to make a living. And there are a couple different dimensions to this difficulty. There's a very natural difficulty. The ocean, any large body of water, is not hospitable to human life. Right? The ocean does not want you there. And it does not intend to help you survive if you take it upon yourself to go there. So Salim and Simon would have shared this in common, just natural difficulty. Fish do not want to be caught, believe it or not. They've developed some coping strategies to avoid it. And so they're doing something difficult and dangerous just because of the natural way of the world. But that difficulty is compounded, that natural difficulty is compounded by an unnatural one. In Salim's case, that unnatural difficulty takes the form of occupation. He and his people live under military occupation. In Simon's case, that difficulty was compounded by occupation. He and his people lived under military occupation. The occupiers are different. Simon is dealing with the rule of Rome, which is different from what Salim is dealing with, but they're both living under occupation, which takes this already difficult and stressful way to make a living and just amps up the difficulty even further. For Simon, the occupying force ultimately was Rome, but probably his primary experience of it was mediated through a guy by the name of Herod Antipas. There are a number of guys named Herod featured in the New Testament. It can actually be hard to keep track of them because they all share this same name, Herod. But Herod Antipas is one of the sons of Herod that was his father, also named Herod, who we often refer to as Herod the Great. And Herod seems to be the king who was ruling when Jesus was born, at least in Matthew's understanding of the chronology. And he was a pretty successful ruler in a lot of ways. He was a tremendous builder. He had a lot of visions for how to build up the coastline. He built the temple. He did a lot of building projects on behalf of Rome. But he also was a little bit insane, maybe a lot of bit insane. There are stories about how terribly his mental health deteriorated before his death that are just wild. So at his death, his kingdom ends up getting carved up by the Roman Empire. So you have the Romans sort of ruling over everything, but they want a local strongman that they can rely on to manage things when they're not there with their army. And so Herod the Great dies, and his kingdom gets divided up, and part of it ends up going to his son, Herod Antipas. And Herod, it seems, really, really wants to be great. Herod Antipas wants to be king. He wants the title of monarch or maybe ethnarch, ruler of an ethnic people, but he ends up with the title of tetrarch, which means 1/4 king. What a terrible insult. Here's this dude who was born, his dad is Herod the Great, and he is Herod the 1/4 king. I mean, how embarrassing is that? And it seems like he really, really, really wanted to be king. We know this because he makes trips to visit Roman emperors under 3 successive emperors. He goes to Herod Augustus near the beginning of his reign, and he goes to Herod Augustus and says, "Can I be king?" And Herod says, "No, you can be 1/4 king." And then at the end of his reign, he goes to a different emperor named Claudius. He goes to Claudius, he says, "Can I be king?" And Claudius says, "No, actually, I'm going to banish you into exile because I heard you were up to no good." But in the middle, there's an emperor named Tiberius. And Herod seems to think he really has a shot with Tiberius, that if he plays his cards right, Tiberius might elevate him, might promote him from Herod the 1/4 king to Herod the full king, and depose his brother and sister who ended up with portions of his dad's kingdom. And so he has to find a way to curry favor with Tiberius. And there are a couple ways to do that. One is through status. He has to find some way to improve Tiberius' status, and the other is through money. He has to bring tribute to Rome to show Tiberius, I can make this little backwater province profitable. But Herod doesn't have a lot of cards to play. Right, Herod has a pretty weak hand. Most of his people are living at the level of subsistence. The ground is not super duper productive, so it's not like he's going to grow this region into another breadbasket to compete with Egypt and send lots of grain back to Rome. But he does have one resource that if he handles it right, he might be able to leverage this resource into becoming king. And so what he does is he takes his capital, that's kind of inland, a town called Sepphoris, and he moves it 20 miles. And he builds a new capital city on the lake of the Sea of Galilee, or what Luke calls for us Lake Gennesaret. It's the same body of water. So he moves his capital 20 miles to the coastline of the sea, and it seems like his desire, his intent, is to commercialize the lake, to find a way to extract revenue from this that he can route toward Tiberias. How do we know this? Well, he names his capital city very inventively Tiberias. He names it in honor of his sponsor, his patron. And then he says, you know this lake that some of you call Gennesaret and some of you call Galilee? We're not going to call it that name anymore. This is now Lake, again, very inventively, Lake Tiberias. He moves his capital, he rebrands the lake, and it seems like his intention is to leverage what had been a natural resource and turn it into a political bargaining chip by extracting wealth from it and funneling that wealth up the socioeconomic hierarchy until it gets to Tiberias. Because this will strengthen his hand, and maybe, just maybe, he can go to Tiberias and say, look, I built a city and named it in your honor. There's this whole lake named after you in your honor, and look at all this money that I've extracted from the fishermen living along this lake. This is his game. And what this does is it creates all kinds of pressure for someone like Simon, because he had a hard enough job already before any of this happened. He and his family had probably been subsistence fishermen for generations, just barely scraping by enough to make ends meet. And now here comes Herod, the one-quarter king, moving his capital city from inland to the coastline and saying, now we're going to start extracting revenue from you. I should note I'm borrowing an awful lot of this thesis from a scholar that I actually have some pretty strong disagreements with, but I think he's spot on in this regard. His name's John Dominic Crossan. And he sort of started thinking in this direction late in his career when he came across this archaeological discovery where they found a boat that had been encased in mud, most likely for almost 2,000 years. A boat that would have been exactly the type that Simon took out into the ocean. Some people even call it the Jesus boat, although there's no indication that Jesus ever actually set foot in that specific boat. But when they studied this archaeologically, what they found is that this boat had been kind of cobbled together and patched together. There were at least 12 different kinds of wood that had gone into trying to keep this boat afloat. He compared it to going into Havana in the early 2000s and seeing all these cars from the 1950s around. And what Crossan says is this tells you everything you need to know about the social situation. You have remarkably gifted mechanics, and they're working with incredibly scarce resources. Because there are newer cars than that. Why is anyone doing this? There could have been newer boats than this, but they were patching this thing, trying to make it stay afloat because they faced such severe, serious economic pressure in the form of Herod, the one-quarter king, coming in and trying to turn what had been their livelihood into a political bargaining chip in his quest to become full king under the auspices of Tiberius. And the primary form this would have taken is taxes. Between the lake and the table, there's always a tax booth. Any table that Jesus sat at, any meal that Jesus enjoyed, all of that production, all of that economic activity had been heavily, heavily taxed. Right? Almost every step in the acquisition, the processing, and the distribution of fish gets taxed. Right? Just to show up on the lake with your boat, you have to pay a fee. The fee goes to Herod Antipas. He considered the lake his royal property. And so anyone who wanted to show up and use it had to pay taxes. You probably paid a fee to register your boat. There's a good chance you couldn't even buy your boat without borrowing some money from folks. They charge really high interest rates. And then you paid a fee to use the harbors that Herod Antipas had built. You paid a fee to have your fish processed. You paid a fee to move your fish. Every time you passed from one province into another, there was a tax booth there waiting for you to extract a little bit of revenue. It's hard to recreate the situation exactly, but most estimates I read suggest that somewhere between 40 and 60% of a fisherman's daily catch disappeared into taxes. So they got to bring home less than half of what they caught in what is already a difficult, demanding job where you don't experience a lot of success. And look, most of us do not enjoy paying taxes. I get that. There are all kinds of systems that we build to try to minimize our tax obligation, but I want to suggest that just like Simon's experience of fishing was very different than ours, so was his experience with taxes. Because this extractive system could be brutal. There's a historian by the name of Philo. He lived in Alexandria in Egypt around the same time as Simon and Jesus. Slightly different part of the Roman Empire. But he recounts this story where there were some people that he knew who owed taxes. And they didn't have the means to pay. And so what they did is they fled. They just took off. And what the tax collector did in response was to kidnap their wives, their children, and their parents. Now, I will spare you the gruesome details that Philo recounts in his story, but his contention is that this tax collector invented new methods of torture to use against the spouses, children, and parents of those who had fled his jurisdiction in a bid to try to get their relatives to pay up. Philo concludes his story by saying there were some passersby, just fellow citizens, who saw these people being tortured and actually killed them themselves to spare them further pain and suffering. That's how brutal it was. And this was over a tax debt. Now, we don't know if this sort of practice was common under the reign of Herod Antipas, but I think it helps give you a sense of the kind of world that someone like Simon was living in. He works a hard job. Fishing is difficult. And then what already is a hard job where he's just kind of hand to mouth every day, now between that process comes the tax collector. And not just one, but a multitude of tax collectors. Because Rome is directly taxing in some ways, and then Herod is taxing in some ways, and then he's farming out some of these taxes to others who bid on the taxes and say, I'll give you this much up front for the right to collect taxes, and then they're trying to collect as absolute much as they can. It's a brutal, brutal, extractive system. And here comes Jesus, showing up, talking about the kingdom, the reign of God. Showing up on the lake that Herod, the one-quarter king, claimed ownership of. And here's Jesus not just saying he has authority, but demonstrating his authority. Herod thinks he owns these fish. Watch what I can do with these fish. Right? If Mary's back there singing about unjust rulers being torn down from their thrones, there are an awful lot of real flesh and blood human beings who qualify. Folks like Herod Antipas, folks like Tiberius, his entire system of tax collectors, all of them had set themselves up as rulers and were acting in unjust ways, extracting from the people around them, exploiting the people around them. And here is Jesus coming and saying there is a different way. And what I think we would expect in this moment is that Jesus calls someone like Simon, who calls James and John the sons of thunder, right? Serious dudes. And they start getting together and they're like, well, where can we maybe get some weapons? Where can we maybe hide out for a little bit? Where can we start to plan the way that we're going to assault those rulers who reign over us in unjust ways? Because this happens in Jesus' time. In fact, about 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, a group of people try to do exactly that. They've set themselves up as a band of revolutionaries. They are going to throw off the occupying power. And do you know their very first action? They storm a Roman fort and they burn all of the debt records. That's how they start their revolution. Right? Because this is front and center in people's day-to-day lives. And so there are an awful lot in Jesus' day of would-be messiahs, would-be revolutionaries who start their movement as tax protesters. Because this is the most visible, direct sign of Roman occupation. I am trying to fish, and I want to get my fish over here to feed my family, but between the lake and the table, there's this tax collector. And surely God will act justly, which might mean that this tax collector, he's got to go. His boss, he's got to go. His boss, he's got to go. They've all got to be torn down from their thrones, and typically that looks like violent revolution and execution. But then Jesus does this bizarre thing. Afterward, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. And they're still in the lake region. They're around the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias, however you want to describe it. This is where they are, and these are the taxes that Levi is collecting. The text doesn't say this explicitly, but I have a hunch that when Simon would get whatever meager catch he got any day and would try to get it back to feed his family, in between the lake and the table would be the tax collector booth, and there is Levi sitting there taking his cut. This extractive system that's going to get funneled up a little bit to Herod Antipas and then up above him a bunch to Tiberius, right? Levi is playing a role in this unjust, exploitative system. And so you might expect that Jesus would say, here's our chance. We can tear this petty tyrant down from this throne. It's not what Jesus does. What Jesus does for this tax collector is give him the exact same invitation that Simon got. And Levi's response is the exact same response that Simon has. Simon, James, and John, in Luke 5:11, leave everything and follow Jesus. And Levi gets up, leaves everything, and follows Jesus. So these two people both caught up in this exploitative system that makes it hard to survive, makes it hard to feed your family. They're both caught up in this system. And what Jesus does is Jesus summons both of them to him, to a new way of life. And then what Levi does is Levi says, let's have a dinner party. And again, Luke doesn't tell us this specifically, but I have a hunch that Luke is nudging us to consider that Simon might have been at this dinner party. Right? Simon is following Jesus, and Jesus is going to Levi's house. So where is Simon going if he's following Jesus? He is going to Levi's house. And then what do these observers say? We'll get more into the significance in the coming weeks about what it means for people to criticize Jesus about who's at the table. But what do they say? Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors, that's Levi, and sinners? Who in the text has most recently identified themselves as a sinner? Simon. Get away from me, Lord. I am a sinner. And so you have in this exploitative, brutal system of extraction and repression, you have Jesus inviting two participants who function in different roles in opposition to one another, and Jesus invites them both to follow him, and they likely all end up at a dinner table together. So Jesus confronts this seemingly intractable, this all-encompassing, this brutal system of extraction and repression in the form of occupation. Jesus confronts all of this not with force, but with food. It is not a call to violent uprising, to beat back those enemies that we see as enemies of us and therefore enemies of God, but it's an invitation to join them at the table and to share a meal. So I want to leave you with a couple questions to consider this coming week. Maybe these are questions that you might actually talk about around a table sometime. First question is this: who is like Levi in your life? Who do you point to or think about when you think about the state of the world and you point to someone and you say, that person is complicit in an unjust, corrupt system? Or that person's actions actively make my life worse. That person is standing between me and full flourishing. Who is that person in your life? Who do you look at the way Simon may have looked at Levi? The tax collector who stands between the lake and the table. Who is like Levi in your life? Then another question, a question I think might actually be more challenging for some of us to consider. Who is like Simon in your life? And the reason I say this is more challenging is both because it's harder to see. The sorts of systems that we participate in tend to obscure from us the folks who suffer because of our own actions, but also because it is so much harder to admit. Like, we work hard for our status, our standing in life. We work hard for our financial resources. We work hard, and it is much, much easier to not think about the folks who suffer in those systems that we participate in. Like, Levi is just doing his job. He's probably bid on the rights to collect taxes in a certain region, so he's got a debt, he's got an obligation. He has to make sure he puts in the work to get the money he needs from these fishermen who never catch enough fish, but he's got to do the work because his bosses are expecting it of him and their bosses are expecting it. He is caught up in this interlocking web of injustice and probably just trying to do the absolute best that he can. But his actions are actively harming folks like Simon and James and John. And all of us participate with varying degrees of willingness or enthusiasm in systems that can harm people. And so who is like Simon in our lives? And then one final question, to think about the actual practice of Jesus, the way that Jesus inaugurates this grand reversal that will culminate at the cross. What guest lists do you influence? When you think about the tables that you sit at, folks who are invited to tables you host, times when you are a guest, what are the guest lists that you influence? And are there ever times that our tables become spaces where someone like Simon, someone like Levi can find themselves at the same table? Because absent that direct, personal, human connection, it is so easy for anger and hatred and animosity to fester. And it's even easy for us. We look at the situation, we say, well, Simon's blameless in this. He's just trying to make a living. Levi's the one who's the problem, but Simon's the one who self-identifies, I am a sinful man. Even though he's just trying to do the work, put in the work, he's trying to just make ends meet. He recognizes he too is caught up in this system, and so is Levi. So who in your life is like Levi? Who are the people you point to and look at and say, they are the problem in the world? But who are the people like Simon, who might look at you and say, no, actually, you are the problem in the world? And what are the guest lists that we influence? Spaces, opportunities, moments for people who sit in these different parts of these interlocking, complex, exploitative systems to come together and meet each other as human beings face to face. I think about the context of Simon and Levi, the world that they live in, and it just seems so messy. And some of that messiness is because we're 2,000 years removed, and so we're trying to recreate it from boats that got stuck in the mud a while ago, and we're trying to rebuild records and trying to do all this complex historical work. But the more you start to do that, the more you realize this was such a messy, messy moment. And the politics were so tense and unpleasant. And yet this is exactly the moment that God chooses to enter into the fullness of human experience. To experience the unjustness of the system, the tension, the pressure, the animosity, the hatred, the potential for violence, God enters into and experiences all of that. There's this brutal economic and political reality, but God's response is not a new form of domination. Jesus just becoming Herod Antipas or Tiberius, taking over the system, making a few tweaks around the edges, trying to improve it from the inside. Jesus' response is not any taking power for himself, but Jesus' response is a new form of human relationship, where someone like Simon and someone like Levi find themselves in the presence of Jesus at the same table. Would you pray with me? Gracious and merciful God, we give you thanks for your faithfulness to your creation. That even when we build these complex, unjust systems that harm people, you remain faithful to us. And you, even in the form of Jesus, enter in and experience it in all of its complexity and brutality. So we pray, God, whether we find ourselves more in Simon's situation or more in Levi's situation, that ultimately we would hear the summons of Jesus to follow him, to join him at the table. And we pray that you would meet us. In the name of Christ, amen.